But today we're going to do some heavy-duty philosophy. And philosophy often starts with a paradox. So I want to start with a paradox. The paradox is this. There are a class of facts in the world that are real, honest-to-John, objective facts. But they're only facts by human subjective agreement. They're only what they are because we think that's what they are. You are citizens of Norway. I am a professor in the University of California, and these sorted bits of paper that I carry around in my wallet are only money because we think that they're money. Now here's the amazing thing though, it's an objective fact. When I take these things into a store and I give them to people, they don't say, maybe you think it's money, but who cares what you think? Well, they really do accept it. By the way, American tourists are always amazed by the fact that people all over the world will accept what seems to them monopoly money. But in any case, it does work. Now, how can that be? Well, in a sense, that's part of what this lecture is about. But I want to begin by making a distinction, which I think is absolutely crucial, and that's the distinction between two senses of the objective-subjective distinction. You'd be surprised how much bad philosophy rests on a failure to see this distinction between the epistemic sense of the objective-subjective distinction and the ontological sense. So, for example, if I say that Rembrandt was born in 1606, that is, as they say, a matter of objective fact. That's epistemically objective. If I say Rembrandt is a better painter than Vermeer, well, that's a matter of subjective opinion. So this is the epistemic sense of the objective-subjective distinction. We have epistemic objectivity when I say Rembrandt was born in 1606, but if I say Rembrandt is a better painter than Vermeer, that's a matter of subjective opinion. But this distinction between epistemic objectivity and subjectivity is based on a more profound distinction in modes of existence. Pains and tickles and itches only exist insofar as they are experienced by a human or animal subject. They are, in that sense, ontologically subjective. But mountains, molecules, and tectonic plates exist no matter what anybody thinks. They're ontologically objective. Now, here's the point for this discussion. You can have an epistemically objective claim about a domain that is ontologically subjective. And a great deal of philosophical confusion rests on a failure to see that fact. When I first got interested in the brain, I told all these neuroscientists, you guys ought to get busy and solve the problem of consciousness. What am I paying you to do if you don't solve the problem of consciousness? A standard answer I got was, look, on your own account, consciousness is subjective, but science is objective. Therefore, there can be no science of consciousness. Oh, God. But anyway, you all know the answer to that is yes, indeed. Consciousness is ontologically subjective, but there is no reason that you cannot have an epistemically objective science of a domain that is ontologically subjective. I can't tell you how long it took me to get that message across, but anyway, I think it now is across. Nobody says we can't study consciousness because it's subjective and science is objective. Science is indeed epistemically objective in the sense that we're trying to get truths that are not dependent on the feelings and attitudes of the scientists, but there's nothing to prevent an objective, epistemically objective science of a domain that's ontologically subjective. Economics is a good case in point. Economists tend to forget this, but the domain they study is created by human ontological subjectivity. Money and property and exchange and the stock market and all the rest of it is created by ontological subjectivity, but you can have an epistemically objective science. Okay, so that's the first step, but that doesn't answer our question. We now have to go on and ask, well, what is it about these facts that make them epistemically objective if, as in the case of money and private property and nationality and universities and cocktail parties and summer vacations, they are what they are only because we think they are. That is, if they're ontologically subjective, all the same, we can have epistemically objective knowledge of these ontologically subjective facts. How does it work? Well, I want to tell you the answer that I originally gave to that, and then I want to tell you how I try to improve on the answer in a later book. The book is called Making the Social World. By the way, we're all at the mercy of publishers. I worked very hard to get the goddamn cover right, and then the cover looks great in Europe, but in America they produced exactly the same book with an ugly cover. Oh, well, you can't help it. Okay, here goes. I thought it was very simple to explain how we can get an epistemically objective reality that's ontologically subjective. It is by the application of certain principles. Now, the first principle you have to have is the principle that we're making a distinction between the observer relative and the observer independent. And this is important for what I just said, because the phenomenon we're going to be studying are all observer relative. Money and property and government and marriage, they exist only relative to observers, but for that very reason, they contain, I can't really draw the line from ontological subjectivity to observer relativity, but imagine it, that we're discussing a class of observer relative facts. Now, these facts require the existence of human cooperation. They require the existence of what I call collective intentionality. It's only because we collectively agree or accept that this is money, or that this such and such is private property, or that we're in the country of Norway, or that this is the University of Oslo. It's only because we accept those with collective intentionality that these observer relative facts can exist. The collective intentionality is used what for? Now we get into more detail. Human beings and some animals have the capacity to assign functions to objects, where the function is always observer relative. So I carry around in my pocket various objects like this one and this one, and these objects perform functions where we have assigned the function to the object. But and functions are always observer relative. Typically, we assign the function in virtue of physical structure. So this thing that I'm waving in my hand performs the function of a piece of chalk only because it has a certain physical structure. But now comes the genius of the human serpent, and it's this. Human beings, unlike, as far as I know, any other animal, have the capacity to assign functions to objects where the function is not performed in virtue of the physical structure, or not solely in virtue of the physical structure, but in virtue of the fact that there is a collective assignment to the object or the person as having a certain status, and with that status, a function that can only be performed in virtue of that collective acceptance. And I call those status functions. And that's where we get to the piece of paper that I have in my pocket. A piece of paper can perform a function, not in virtue of its physical structure, but in virtue of the fact that we have assigned a certain status to it. It has the status of money, and with that status, a function that can be performed in virtue of that collective assignment. If we stop making that assignment to it, it can't perform that function. Now, the first claim I want to make is that status functions are pervasive. You are locked into a more or less invisible system of status functions. The money you have in your pocket or in your bank account, the amount of money you owe on your student loans, your position as a property owner or as a licensed car driver or as a husband or a wife, all of these are status functions. So our first major theoretical task now is to ask, how does the ontology of status functions work? How is it possible that there can be a class of ontologically subjective but epistemically objective status functions where the status function is performed only in virtue of the collective assignment and recognition of the status function? Okay, now I'm going pretty fast, but how's it doing? Everybody up with me? All right. I'm going to take this thing off. I'm getting kind of hot. All right. Thanks. Okay, now I thought I had a neat answer to that, and I want to tell you what the answer is, because I think it's pretty good, but it doesn't quite work, and we'll see why. It seemed to me all status functions were the result of the application of a simple principle. When I was working on language, it seemed to me there are two different kinds of rules. There was what I call rules that regulate antecedently existing forms of behavior, and I call those regulative rules, like drive on the right. But there are rules that don't just regulate antecedently existing forms of behavior, but they create the very possibility of the behavior that they regulate. The rules of games are obvious examples of that. So the rule drive on the right regulates activity that exists independently of the rule, but the rules of chess, for example, do not regulate an activity that exists independently. It was not the case that there were a lot of guys pushing bits of wood around on boards, and somebody finally said, fellas, we got to get some rules, because you keep banging into my bishop with your knight, and you keep knocking over my pawns with your king. No, it's not like that. That's the philosopher's favorite example. So you get a set of rules that are not just regulative, all rules are regulative, but you get constitutive rules. And it seemed to me that those rules always had the same structure. The structure is X counts as Y in context C. So, for example, such and such counts as a legal knight's move. Such and such a position counts as check. Such and such a form of check counts as checkmate. You, in virtue of some X feature that you satisfy, count as a citizen of Norway, or you count as a student in the University of Oslo. It's in virtue of satisfying a certain X condition that you're assigned a Y status function. And it seemed to me that was a beautiful structure for analyzing the structure of human civilization. And it's almost right. I'll have to tell you some corrections to it in a moment. But the idea is this. We gradually build up human complex societies of money and government and cocktail parties and summer vacations and university degrees and lawyers and doctors by repeated applications of this constitutive rule, X counts as Y in context C. Now, at first sight, you might say, it's too feeble an apparatus. You can't create human civilization like that. Well, it has two formal features that are quite remarkable. One is it iterates upward indefinitely. And the second is it spreads out laterally. So let's go through those. I make noises through my mouth. It's always amazing to me. The University of California pays me a lot of money to do that, but I do it. And whenever I get dismayed at how much money they pay me, I realize how much money they're paying my colleagues, and then I get less depressed by the absurdity of the situation. But now here's the interesting thing. I make noises through my mouth. Those noises count as the utterance of English sentences, right? But the utterance of certain English sentences in certain contexts counts as making a promise. But now the making of a promise of a certain kind counts as getting married. It counts as a legal contract, right? So you go sentence, speech act of promising. Promising is a contract, and the contract is marriage. And you see what's happening in all of these cases. It iterates upward because x1 counts as y1, but y1 equals x2, and that counts as y2. Everybody got that? And then you can keep going up indefinitely. So I said, well, the noises count as sentences, the sentences count as speech acts, the speech act counts as a promise, the promise counts as a contract, the contract counts as getting married. And in the state of California, when you get married, all hell breaks loose institutionally, because you're entitled to income tax deduction, spousal benefits, you get all sorts of rights from the university. Males even get pregnancy leave and all that kind of stuff, because they are legally married. So you have this iterated upward structure. Furthermore, it spreads out laterally in ways that are amazing. You never just have a single institutional fact, the fact that I'm a citizen, or the fact that I have money in my pocket. It's always within an extremely complex interlocking structure. So I don't just have money, but I have money in my bank account at the Bank of America in the city of Berkeley on Telegraph Avenue. It's put there by my employers, the regents of the university, and I use it to pay my credit card bills, my income, state and local income tax, and all kinds of other boring things that I have to pay. Now notice every noun phrase I mentioned there, with the possible exception of Telegraph Avenue, mentions an institutional fact. So you have this extremely widespread network of status functions. It's amazing that society is so powerful when it's so invisible. But if you start looking around for status functions, you will find they are everywhere. Okay, anyway, I like that theory. It seemed to be a pretty nice theory, and also had a feature that I like, namely, humans aren't all that smart, and we're not going to use some elaborate apparatus to create human civilization. It's a single device, repeated over and over and over in all kinds of areas. However, there are some difficulties with it, and when I published this, a whole lot of interesting objections came out. I want to mention them. One, I thought of myself. Sometimes you don't need a constitutive rule. You just haul off and create an institutional fact. You just decide we're going to let Sally be the boss. She's going to be the chairman of the meeting, or the captain of the softball team, or whatever. You don't need a prior constitutive rule that says people like Sally always count as having a certain status function. So that was the one sort of objection. Another objection is that sometimes you can create, I call these cases the ad hoc cases, where you just create an institutional fact by getting people to agree to it. But another interesting class of cases are where you create an institutional fact without having an X term, what Barry Smith calls the freestanding Y terms. And once you look around, those are actually quite pervasive. My favorite example of an institutional fact is money, the fact that this is a 100 kroner note. But indeed, most of the money in the world today has no physical existence at all. There are magnetic traces on computer disks in bank that represent the amount of money you have in the bank. But the magnetic trace isn't money, it just represents money. Now that's an amazing fact. Something can exist only insofar as it's represented, but the representation doesn't represent anything independent of itself. It creates the fact by representing that fact as existence. That is, again, in philosophy, you gotta allow yourself to be stunned by what any sane person takes for granted, okay? And I'm saying we ought to allow ourselves to be stunned by the fact that there are lots of institutional facts. There are these wide terms that don't rest on any physical basis. Corporations, humans are ingenious, and the invention of the limited liability corporation is one of the most ingenious inventions, again, of the human serpent. The corporation has no physical existence. It's true there are buildings and officers, but the actual corporation, I looked it up. I have this wonderful research tool. It's called Google. And what would take me all day long, I can find in 30 seconds. Look up California law concerning corporations. It takes 30 seconds and it comes up. Anybody can create a corporation. We could today decide to create a corporation of all the people in this room as the shareholders of the corporation. And you simply have to file. You have to perform a speech act. You have to file articles of incorporation. So that led me, these facts led me to think the fact that there are these cases where you do it on an ad hoc basis, and there are these cases where you just create an institutional fact out of the clear blue sky, so to speak. The freestanding cases where you don't have any brute fact on which the institutional fact is based. That led me to rethink the whole analysis and its relation to language. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to talk. How am I doing for time? How much did I have?
20 more minutes.
I have 20 more minutes?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. 20 minutes, heavy duty. I better have a drink of water. 20 minutes, all right. To explain how this works, I have to say a little bit more about language. Now, intuitively, we feel that you can't have these institutional facts without language in a way that you can have language without the other institutional facts. So we feel you could imagine a society that had language but didn't have government or private property, that didn't even have marriage. It just has, they talk to each other, but they don't have these elaborate institutional structures. But you can't imagine the converse. You couldn't imagine a society with an elaborate system of private property, government, and marriage, but no language. They couldn't talk to each other. That doesn't make sense. Why not? What is it about language? To tell you about how language works in the creation of human civilization, I have to tell you a bit about how language works in general. From an evolutionary point of view, language is built on top of pre-linguistic, biologically more primitive forms of intentionality. Intentionality is that fancy philosopher's word. It means the capacity of the mind to represent objects and states of affairs in the world. So beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and perceptions are all intentional states. It's confusing for English speakers because it sounds a lot like intending in the sense in which I intend to go to the movies. But intentionality is just, but intending is just one kind of intentionality. It's probably not a problem in Norwegian. It's we all, like most confused philosophical terms, we owe it to the Germans, and it's not a confusion in German. No, in German, intentionality does not sound like Absicht, that German for intention. So it doesn't take long to get over it. Anyway, intentional states typically have this structure. You have a type of state, and it has a propositional content. So you believe that it's raining, you fear that it's raining, you hope that it's raining. Okay, now the Speech Act has the same structure. The Speech Act of stating that it's raining has this structure, except the Speech Act is an intentional act, and this is just a state. Now the way you get from this thing, the belief that it's raining, to the statement that it's raining, is you learn to make noises. You say things like, it's raining, es regnet, il pleut, and whatever that Norwegian would be. And in those cases, then, you create meaning by imposing the conditions of satisfaction, that's the truth conditions, onto your utterance. You represent how things are by intentionally producing a noise that enables you to represent how things are. There's a convention according to which you can represent how things are by making that noise. I'm going too fast. Let me slow down and go over this a little more slowly. Intentional states, beliefs, hope, fears, desires, perceptions, and all the rest of it, love and hate, and anger and lust and disgust, they all represent how things are in the world or how we would like them to be. However, all that's pre-linguistic. What happens when you get language is that you take this pre-linguistic form of representation and you make it explicit. Now, these things with this structure, the structure that it's raining, they have conditions under which they are true or false, and I call those conditions of satisfaction. So the belief will be satisfied only if it's true. The desire will be satisfied only if it's fulfilled. The intention will be satisfied only if it's carried out. Now, the secret of understanding speaker meaning is that we have conventions and we have learned to make noises through our mouth that have conditions of satisfaction, the same conditions of satisfaction of the intentional states. So if I believe that it's raining, my belief is satisfied if it's raining. But if I make the noises, it's raining, then I impose those conditions of satisfaction onto the noises. And that is a major human achievement because it is the creation of meaning, speaker meaning. Okay, now then, next step. How many ways do we have of doing that? Well, at least 2 ways are these. If you make a statement or an assertion or a description, you present me with a noise that's supposed to represent how things are in the world. The conditions of satisfaction go from the noise to the world. We have the word, what I call the word to world direction of fit. The noises are supposed to represent how things are in the world. And I think in simple metaphors, so represent that with a downward arrow, and that is the word to world direction of fit. This is true of statements, descriptions, explanations, characterizations, all of those things that can be true or false. True or false have the word to world direction of fit. But now there are lots of utterances where we express an intentional state which does not have that direction of fit. There are things like orders and commands and promises where the aim is not to represent how things are, but how we would like someone to make them be or how we intend to make them be. And I say of those kinds of cases that they have the upward. They have this direction of fit. They have the world to word direction of fit. And notice we don't say of these orders, commands, and promises that they are true or false, but that we say they are obeyed or disobeyed, kept or broken. So the simplest test for whether or not something has this direction of fit is, can you say that it's true or false? Statements, assertions, descriptions, explanations, and that's characteristic of assertions and statements. But here we have the world to word direction of fit. That is characteristic of orders, commands, promises, vows, threats, and pledges, where the aim is not to represent how the world is, but to change the world by getting the world to change and match the words. Okay, now everybody's got it. We make these noises through our mouth, and they represent how we'd like things to be, if it's an order or a promise, how we intend to make them be, or they represent how we think things are, if it's a statement, such as the statement that it's raining, or we are now in Oslo. Okay, now everybody's up with me. Then there comes an amazing development, and again, as far as I know, only humans can do this. I don't know any other animal that can do that. We have a class of utterances that make something the case, and thus they achieve the upward or world-to-word direction of fit. But they do it by representing the thing that we're trying to make to be the case as already being the case. That's an amazing phenomenon. And it turns out they have both directions of fit. Once they create a reality by representing that reality as existing. They create the reality and thus achieve the upward or world-to-word direction of fit, but they do it by representing that reality as existing. And just to have a name, I call these declarations, where you make a reality by declaring that reality to exist. Whereas these guys are assertives, where you assert something as a case, and these guys are either directives, as in the case of orders and commands, or they're commissives, as in the case of promises, vows, and pledges. Okay, now I want to advance a very strong thesis. All of human institutional reality, money, cocktail parties, summer vacations, driver's licenses, all of human institutional reality is created by repeated representations that have the logical form of declarations. Declarations that create status functions. So just to have a name, let's call them all status function declarations. So institutional reality is both created in its initial form and maintained in its existence by repeated application of representations that have this logical form. They have the logical form of creating a reality by representing that reality as existing. And how can that exist? I mean, isn't it a kind of word magic to think you can create reality just by saying something? Well, the earliest investigations of this were done by my old professor in Oxford, Austin, who discovered what he called a performative utterance, where you make something the case by saying that it's the case. You adjourn the meeting by saying the meeting is adjourned. Or you promise to come and see somebody by saying, I promise to come and see you. Or you declare war by saying war is hereby declared. Now, all of those cases have an explicit verb that names the speech act they're performing. All of those performatives are declarations. But not every declaration contains a performative verb. It contains a verb that names the type of speech act that you are performing and thus creating. There are lots of declarations that look quite innocent. On these sorted pieces of paper, American money, there's a mysterious utterance. And again, in philosophy, you gotta be astounded by what any sane person regards as too obvious to be worth mentioning. It says here, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Well, we're all epistemologists, and we wonder, how do they know? What's the evidence? Have they actually done a study? Have they done a survey? That it really is legal tender? No, they didn't discover it. They declared it. They made it the case by declaration. And so on with private property and government and marriage and all the rest of it. Barack Obama is president not in virtue of any physical fact that he has, not in virtue of the fact that his DNA has presidential chromosomes in it, not at all. He is president in virtue of the fact that there is a collectively accepted status function declaration that makes him president. And, though this is a tougher point to clarify, but I will say a bit about it, not only do we create institutional reality by status function declarations, but we maintain it in its existence by the continued applications of representations that have the form, and need not always be explicit status function declarations, but they have the logical form of a status function declaration. Now that last point is less obvious, so let me repeat these 2 points. The first point is that all of human institutional reality is created in its initial existence by representations that have the logical form of a status function declaration. That is, they have both direction of fit. They need not be explicit. You need not create Sally as the boss by saying, Sally's the boss, or I hereby create Sally's the boss, but you can say things like, well, we can't really decide this issue until Sally comes. My God, we couldn't do anything unless Sally approved. That's all of those have the logical form of the status function declaration because they're making something the case by representing it as being the case. Now I want to say also, in the continuation of the institutional fact requires continuous status function declarations, or rather it requires representations, utterances, thoughts that have the logical form of the status function declaration. That's harder to show, but I think you'll see it if you look at social change. One of the interesting social changes is the change in the position of women that has occurred in the United States and in Europe over the past 50 years or so. Now, one of the things the feminists recognized early on was the crucial functioning of the vocabulary. They didn't want people to continue to refer to ladies and gentlemen. Now I think it's become harmless, but at the time they were threatened by it because that marked an existing system of status functions that they wanted to overcome. Similarly, when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, they wanted to abolish all of the traditional forms of address that marked people's status within an aristocratic or peasant hierarchy. They wanted everybody to be just known as comrade. Those are not harmless. Those are very important shifts because the shift in the vocabulary marks the shift in the status. And if you can get control of the vocabulary, then you've gone a long way toward controlling the status function. So the central thesis that I'm now advancing, which goes beyond what I said earlier, was all of human institutional reality is created by speech acts of the form X counts as Y in context C. But now I've gone the next step and I said, what kind of a speech act is that anyway? What's the direction of fit? And the answer is, it's a declaration, but unlike other sorts of declarations. See, it's interesting, declarations are kind of mysterious, and I don't think religions can exist without some belief in declaration. So, for example, when God said, "Let there be light," what kind of a speech act was that? It didn't mean, Henry over there, turn on the lights. It wasn't an order, and it wasn't a promise. It didn't mean, when I get around to it, I'll make light for you guys. It made it the case by declaration that light exists, and you might check it out how this is translated to other language. Qui soit la lumière, vir der Licht, and I don't know, figure out what the translation is in the Norwegian. All that is a supernatural declaration. Now, we do not have the capacity to do this divine thing of creating light by declaration, but we have a similar miraculous power where we can create money, property, government, marriage, summer vacations, at the University of Oslo, and cocktail parties, all by declaring them to exist. And that, I am claiming, is the essential feature of human civilization, whereby we differ from other sorts of animals. Now, the next step is, how does it work? Okay, so you got all these declarations. What's supposed to happen? Have I got any time left?
Oh, yeah, take your time.
Okay, well, I don't want to bore people with that. Really, let's keep going. Okay, why does it work? What's the big deal? So all right. So you have these status function declarations. What's supposed to happen now that we've got these status function declarations? I had a letter. And the answer is that we create, in creating these status functions, we have created institutional facts. And indeed, I want to say all institutional facts are status functions. Institutional facts equals status functions. But now, what's the point of doing that? And the answer is power. When you create status functions, you create power. All human institutional reality consists of various forms of power, positive and negative, much of it invisible. So, for example, as a professor at the University of California, I am entitled to certain things. Those are positive power. I am authorized to do certain things. Those are positive powers. But I also have negative powers. I have obligations. An obligation is a negative power. A right is a positive power. And indeed, I want to say all institutional fact are status functions, and they all create what I call deontic powers. And deontic powers are rights, duties, obligations, requirements, authorizations, permissions, authority of various kinds. All of those are deontic powers. And again, as far as I know, no animal has it. You see, animals have status hierarchies. There's an alpha male and an alpha female. And then there's the beta male and the beta female. I don't know how far down the ethologists count, but you do get power structures within animals, within animal tribes. But you don't get a deontology. Nobody ever says, we have to go along with Bill because he's the alpha male. That's not a problem because being the alpha male does not mark an institutional fact. See, think of the difference between Barack Obama and the alpha male in a group of primates. Now, the alpha male has a lot of power because the others are all scared of him. But that power lasts only as long as he's tougher than everybody else, only as long as he can beat up everybody else. But Barack Obama does not get up in the morning and think, can I still beat up on everybody else? No, he doesn't have to worry about that because he's got this deontic power. He has all these rights and obligations and duties that come with being president. And the deontic powers create human civilization. Why? Because they lock into human rationality. And when you recognize something as a status function, then by rationality, you have to recognize that it gives you desire-independent reasons for action. So, for example, some nice person invites me to give a talk in Oslo, and I say, yes. Now, on the day in question, I don't have to ask myself, well, what should I do today? You know, what the hell, what do I feel like doing? No, I have created a reason for giving a lecture. And in ordinary English, I have made a promise. I have promised, and in so doing, I have created a reason for action which is independent of my immediate inclinations. So the structure of deontology that comes out of status functions, that comes out of institutional structures, gives us reasons for action which are peculiar as far as I know to human beings. I don't know if some other animals have this, but I don't see how they could, because obligations, rights, duties, and responsibilities can only exist if they are represented as existing. They are observer relative in a crucial way, but they're language relative, because without the concept of an obligation, you can't operate with obligations. You can't reflect, you don't need to have the word, but you've got to have some concept of an obligation in order that you can reflect on your obligations, conflicting obligations, and decide on the basis of that what you're going to do. Okay, so what I maintain now is that our original idea that you can explain human civilization with the structure X counts as Y in context C, not a bad start, but you've got to ask yourself the next question. What kind of a speech act is that? What's going on when you create a Y status function? And the answer is it's a very peculiar kind of speech act because it's a declaration. It makes something the case by representing it as being the case. The point of doing that is to create sets of power relations, positive and negative, conditional, conjunctive, all of the usual logical operations are performed on institutional powers, on deontic powers. And those deontic powers are what enable, they're the glue that holds human civilization together, because they give people reasons for acting that are independent of their immediate inclinations. How much time am I out? I'm out of time, presumably.
Well, you can take some
Okay,
time.
well, let me just take a sentence or two and go, and then I'll shut up, and then other people can talk. I want you to think how you would apply this analysis, and I have been fascinated. I mean, the newspapers to me are more interesting than I've ever been because I read them in the light of this. What happened in Tunisia and Egypt are absolutely fascinating, because the system of collective intentionality was undermined. You see, collective intentionality only works insofar as it continues to be shared. But where you give people power over you, where the collectivity submit themselves to general power, legitimation becomes crucial. You've got to think it's okay for these guys to have power over us. But a single kid, a single guy set himself on fire in Tunisia, and that undermined the entire system of status functions. And then by this marvelous capacity for imitation, it spread like wildfire all over the Arab world, and we still haven't worked out the extent of its spread. My favorite example of the withdrawal of status functions is that wonderful sequence of events in November of 1989. In 1989, Annus Mirabilis, the Soviet Empire collapsed. Now, if you're brought up in the time when I was brought up, we thought this was a permanent division of the world. into them and us, into the so-called socialist camp and the so-called free world. We thought it would go on forever. No expert predicted, and none of the great experts, not even the tourists, predicted. I mean, you should have been able to predict when you saw Soviet toilet paper, but even then, we didn't. This cannot last. We should have thought, no, why does it make anything go on if everybody, you have a secret police not effective enough? It all came tumbling down. And it came, now, the exact story about how it came tumbling down, that takes more scholarship than I have and more than I've seen anybody have. But basically, Gorbachev lost his self-confidence. That undermined the self-confidence of the elites. And when the elites lost their confidence in the institution, the whole system unraveled with stunning rapidity. Okay, I mentioned these two things. There are lots of other applications of this. I think political power is understood basically as a system of accepted status functions, backed by police and armies, but they too are systems of status functions. The notion of human rights is again, a system of status function. People would like human rights to be like thumbs. You know, you're born with a human right as you're born with thumbs. It's not like that. It's a collective acceptance. It's an ingenious idea that being a human being is a Y term, and thus the bearer of status function, the bearer of human rights. It's a wonderfully ingenious idea. I don't know who thought of it. Sometime in the 18th century, or maybe earlier, maybe it goes back earlier, but it's an Enlightenment idea. It's very much an Enlightenment idea. So the thought I want to leave you with is not just that I've given you a story about human civilization, but I hope that it's a useful tool in analyzing a very large number of problems about human civilization. Thank you very much.